The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Great. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate it. Sure. Well, thanks for having me. My name is Steve Swaffer. I'm the executive director with No.Till on the Plains. We are a 501c3 agricultural education organization. A little bit about myself. I grew up in north central Oklahoma, working on my grandparents' wheat and cattle farm. I also spent a fair amount of my time and graduated from high school in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I had the benefit of both the rural lifestyle as well as an urban exposure to that lifestyle as well. I went to the University of Kansas for 2 degrees, one in biology, and then also my master's degree is in aquatic ecology. And how that translates to farming, it really doesn't, other than ecological concepts apply across various systems. I have spent the last 22 years working with agricultural producers, both for No.Till on the Plains and prior to that, working for the Kansas Farm Bureau as their natural resources director. So No.Till on the Plains, again, is a 501c3. It's a nonprofit. Our mission is to provide high quality education and networking for agricultural producers looking to use systems-based agriculture. And when we say systems-based agriculture, that means that all of the landscape and the various organisms and systems on that landscape work together in a biological system. And so a little bit different than the concept of what we know as modern agriculture, which is very monoculture heavy. Corn or soybeans or wheat are grown consecutive years, oftentimes multiple years in a row with very little rotation between crops, and is heavy in tillage, meaning that after crops, the field is worked with various implements, but typically the soil is disturbed. And so what we try to promote is something that promotes the 5 soil health principles, always keeping the soil covered and protected, keeping a diverse number of plants growing, keeping a root growing for as many days as possible, and using no soil disturbance. And then the final one is livestock integration. And using those principles, we're having a much greater mimicking of the natural cycles that we would see in an undisturbed system out on the landscape. And so our idea is to bring methods, practices, and concepts to producers and allow them to network with one another to see what others are trying on their farms. And then ultimately, hopefully, to produce food in a different fashion than what we see in most modern agricultural settings these days. So that's a little bit about myself and the organization. Sure. So the headquarters of No.Till on the Plains is located in Barrington, Kansas. It also happens to be where I live, but our region of effect is much greater than just this small area or even Kansas. We have really a regional impact here in the plain states of Kansas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, the Dakotas, Texas, Colorado, Missouri, but our influence and our following is across North America, and we have international following as well. So we really are trying to have a global impact and are beginning to have folks tune in and be a part of our presentations, our conferences, our field days from all over the world. Yeah, so we do a number of different things. Obviously, the pandemic changed how we delivered our material and our content for the last 18 months. But prior to that and this coming year, we will have many in-person events both on farms, and No.Till on the Plains is probably best known for its annual winter conference, which occurs every January. This January 2022 will be the 26th annual conference and will take place in Wichita, Kansas. Yeah, it's really centered around those 5 soil health principles. So we'll start with keeping the soil covered. So what we want to see is a 70% or greater percent of the soil covered at any given time of the year, and that's done primarily through two things. One is crop residues that are left after harvest, and then secondly would be the addition of cover crops during those periods when cash crops aren't grown. Again, providing that shading, that insulation, that temperature control and moisture control in those times where typically a producer would be fallow. So trying to have something out there covering the soil, keeping it protected. Secondly, would be keeping a living root in the soil for as many days as possible. So in conventional agriculture, we often see once the crop is harvested, then nothing has been planted back into those soils until the successive crop is seeded. In the system that we promote, as soon as a crop is harvested, whether it be another cash crop, a double crop, or a cover crop, we like to see that ground seeded once again and growing something, so that the exudates from plant roots, which are a sugar-based substance coming out of those roots, are feeding that microbial system in the soil. Disturbing the soil as little as possible. That's where the origin of this organization, No.Till, came from, meaning that the soil is not routinely either plowed or disked or cultivated or harrowed. Any of those conventional agricultural soil disturbance, and typically done for either weed control or seedbed preparation. None of that occurs in the system that we promote. It's really only the time the soil is disturbed is when you're planting the seed. So we're opening up that V, and then we're putting the seed into it, and we're closing it back up. And that's really the primary time that the soil is disturbed under a soil health system. Livestock integration is another one of those soil health principles that really is a result of the separation of enterprises in modern agriculture. When we were younger people and in our grandfathers, the livestock were a major part of the cropping fields. So they were allowed to graze, they were allowed to defecate, they were allowed to urinate on those fields. And as the separation of those enterprises, the livestock were removed from the landscape, we didn't get the benefit of that grazing. We didn't get the benefit of the manures and the urines. And so integrating those animals back into the system, just as we would see in a natural ecosystem, is just another one of those soil health principles, and returning the soil back to a more natural operating system. So really, it's all centered around those 5 soil health principles.
Hey, how you doing, Steve? How you doing, Mark?
Hi, Wayne. How are you today?
I'm good. Sorry I was a little bit late. I'm actually out on a field project in Michigan, and finished rowing a kayak around out in the pond, doing some work there, and thought I was going to be on time, and I just got a few minutes late. So, Steve, so excited that you're here with us. Steve and I had a great talk several weeks ago, everybody, and I just knew that he was going to be a blessing for all of you, and talking about what his passion is. And I've been listening for the last, I think, almost since the start. And Mark, I'm going to let you continue to ask questions for just a minute while I get set up in a little bit better location, so I can speak a little bit better. So why don't you ask 1 or 2 more questions, and then I'll join in. But thank you so much for being here, Steve.
Thanks, Wayne. Sure. Well, I'd probably have to say my grandfather would definitely have been one of my early mentors. He is the person that took me to the farm and showed me about farming. At about the age of 8, I started to join him and help him a little bit. And in addition to the farm, he always encouraged me to watch what was happening around us, particularly as we drove around. And I would say he really was the one that began to hone my observation skills. So I can recall a particular incident where we'd been working on the farm, and I couldn't have been more than 12 or 13 years old, and I decided to take a nap on the way back to the house, and he intentionally woke me up and said, "Hey, you really need to look around." It happened to be just about dusk, and you really need to look around and see what's going on as we drive home. And on the drive home, we saw deer, we saw turkey, we saw quail, and I guess that's really where my skills for observing the natural systems began. Didn't appreciate it at the time, but certainly do now. I had an advisor in graduate school who was very important in my life, Dr. John O'Brien, who is now deceased. But he also encouraged me to explore various aquatic systems while I was in graduate school. And again, that was powers of observation. But probably in my adult life, the last 10 years, it is the farmers that I have met, and there are numerous ones who were not afraid to try something different, to buck the system, if you will, to try to produce crops in a different way that were more friendly to the soil, less intensive chemically, less intensive from a tillage standpoint, and really embrace the diversity of plants as well as the animals. And so I could spend the rest of this time probably naming those folks off, but the founders of No.Till on the Plains would definitely be in that group, that founding board that are in there, that were there when the organization got started, and I'll mention just a couple because I feel particularly close to them, but Keith Thompson from Osage City, Kansas, and Bud Davis, who was retired from NRCS, that would definitely count them in my group of mentors. Yeah. So a couple of books that I read and reread, are fairly important to me, and they're not necessarily current books, but are something that everyone should read, and that would be Aldo Leopold's book. All of us who are in the natural systems of management and those that want to be observers of nature, that is a seminal book for certain. But I would also say books like Dirt by David Montgomery are ones that people should always read. But honestly, we're in gardening season, so my book reading is a little less than it would be in the winter. And I did a lot of reading during the pandemic, so right now I really haven't started anything new. But yeah, I would definitely read any of the books by David Montgomery or Aldo Leopold.
Yeah, I do. I appreciate you guys. Just those are great questions. Are ones that I always ask. Let's go back to the founders of No.Till. Give us a story that you have about any of them that's either funny or insightful or something that you remember that's just kind of a cool story.
Sure. So I've not been with the organization since its inception. Just the last 8 years have I been here. But the two guys that I mentioned, Bud Davis and Keith Thompson, have both relayed this story to me, and I can see it in my mind's eye as it happened. So they were on Keith Thompson's farm, and they were digging in the soil. And they were below the residue level. And as they dug, they saw something they had not seen before. Keith had been in the no-till system for 10 or 15 years and was beginning some cover crops, but there was a white substance below the soil. And it ended up that it was mycorrhizal fungi. And Bud Davis was very excited about it, and Keith didn't even really know what it was at the time. And so that's a great story. But I think the thing that sticks with me the most is anytime you put the shovel in either a child or an adult's hand, and the first time they come up with a shovel full of soil and it's teeming with life, whether that be earthworms or springtails or other macro invertebrates that you find in the soil, there's always this look of amazement on their face of, I didn't really realize how much was going on down there. And our traditional agriculture has really minimized the value of those microbial and macro invertebrate communities to the soil. And it's really fun to see somebody see that life the first time they come up with a shovelful of it.
And Steve, I not on right from the start, but so if this is a repeat, just tell me or tell us. And this is going to be a little funny. So in my part of the world, at least, when I go through a winter in my soil, which is a silty loam, but we can have some very dry times. And it's now time to think about growing things in that soil in the spring. And and let's say it's the first time that you're growing using a no-till concept in a particular field. I don't think it means that you just take the seeds and you sprinkle them over the top of that hard ground that was never handled properly before. What do you define as a method of managing the soil to then allow you to be able to plant for the first time when a soil has never been in a no-till system before? And I know the answer, but I don't think the audience probably does. So
yeah. So it really starts before that seed goes in the ground. So if the soil is bare, it's going to be hard and it's going to crust over, and it's going to make it difficult for the planting tool to penetrate down through that crust and create that V slot that you want. And so the season prior to converting to a no-till seeding methodology, we really want that field to have maintained the residue from the previous crop, meaning that it was not tilled, meaning that it wasn't turned over, whether that be a wheat crop or a corn crop or whatever it was. Leave that standing residue there. And if at all possible, get something growing out there as soon as possible. It could be grazed, it could be just a cover crop to keep that living root. But we're really trying to create a nice, mellow soil that the very sharp planting implement can now get through. And so you will typically, with a planting tool of a small grain, you will have two discs. They will be at an angle and they will be very sharp. And that's very important that they be able to penetrate through the soil as well as the residues that are left there. And they are creating a very clean cut through that soil. And now that seed is placed down at the bottom of that V groove. And behind it, there's an implement that is crumbling that soil back over that seed. It's not packing it down. It's just lightly crumbling it over that seed. And you hope that you don't get side smear, because that creates compaction. And when I say side smear, that the side of that V notch is not smeared from that disc opener. It is just cut. And so you're really trying to create the best seed bed that you can and the cleanest V that you can. And so by covering that seed back up lightly and with adequate moisture, it should be able to germinate. It should be able to get water down at least to that level where that seed is planted.
Great explanation. Really good. Mark, by the way, I won't be able to see them. So if you see audience questions that you want to throw in at any time, go ahead and do that. So do you have any kind of an indication of how many acres in the US, let's say, today are being, crops are being grown using a no-till method?
Yeah, that's a quick question I get pretty frequently, and I can only give you my best estimate. So I'll start with this: that not all no-till is created equal, and probably the term that we prefer is either never till or continuous no-till, meaning that between crops there is not a tillage pass over the field. And the number of no-till acres, so a soybean crop is harvested and the following spring corn is planted in, there's no tillage in between. Well, a soybean crop doesn't leave a lot of residue. There's really no need for tillage except if the farmer likes it for a recreational purpose. We call that recreational tillage. And that is in the National Ag Statistics Service, that is counted as no-till. But following that corn crop, the producer goes back and they actually till those corn stalks in. That's one version of no-till. That's a statistical or a counted no-till. What we're after is continuous no-till, and those numbers of acres are significantly smaller. I would give you my best guess at about 20% of the acres across the United States are in a continuous no-till system. Somewhere 33 to 35% are in a minimum till, or that no-till situation that I described to you earlier, where there's not always tillage, but there is still some regular tillage in the system. So depending on what that definition is, anywhere between 20 and 35% of the acres are in some sort of reduced or continuous no-till.
Great answer. What's a question that you get when you speak, or when you are just with people that you are somewhat perplexed by? This is a tough one, or that you don't really understand how to give an answer related to the no-till concept. Is there anyone that you get that you just sort of struggle with, and even today you really don't have a good answer for? it's a tough one.
Yeah. And it's mostly cultural, Wayne, in that I get younger guys say, well, how do I convince dad to let me do this? Yeah. And quite honestly, dad has to see the numbers, and he has to see the benefit to the farm. And those are not always clear cut, and they certainly vary geographically, because water is the most precious commodity that we have, and you can't grow 4 crops in a year on 16 inches of moisture, but you can grow 2. And so really it's about how do we get over that social hurdle, because dad or grandpa has become accustomed to doing business with local farm suppliers. He's become accustomed to doing business with a seed supplier. He's become accustomed to doing business with the co-op. And if you overturn all of those relationships with those folks, and now you're buying less, it's a difficult social change to make. And so that is probably the most difficult question we get, because the answer is never the same from person to person.
Right, makes sense. By the way, don't you think that's very typical of farmers, multi-generational farmers in general, which is almost every question you could ask that would be something new that they'd be doing, that they would say, why would I do that? My grandpa did it this way, and my dad did it this way, and so I'm going to do it this way, right? I mean, it's not so. Marketing, for example, why do you always take your crop to the elevator versus other kinds of marketing? Dad did it, grandpa did it, I'm going to do it. I don't think it's just it's a cultural. It is very cultural.
It's very much that way, and the ag policy that exists really makes it difficult to change some of those things. The tractor wasn't adopted overnight. It took nearly 25 years from the time the tractor was first introduced for it to be a widely used new method. And so this is not new, and particularly with the investments that are made into modern technology, it's maybe even more difficult to get a widespread change to occur.
Post-planting, so a farmer has now adopted the no-till approach. And the answer may be different for, let's say, a first year versus subsequent years. But what is the difference in the way that you now manage that crop through its growth cycle, whether it be with supplements, whether it be with fertilizers, whether it be your irrigation, all of those sorts of things?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that, Wayne. One is worry less about yield and worry more about profit. And so if the local neighborhood is all about bushels per acre, and you've been in that contest for years with the neighbors, it's going to be difficult, because more than likely to change to this type of system, you're not necessarily going to have more bushels per acre than your neighbor, but you may have more dollars per acre than your neighbor. And isn't that the most important part? Or we all want to believe that it is. The other really adjustment is thinking about the management of the crop itself. So in modern agriculture, we typically have thresholds, whether they be for weeds or for an insect pest. There's a threshold at which it's no longer tolerable, and that's going to impact the yield. And so we've got to get out there and we've got to intervene on behalf of the crop. Now, I really think we have to start thinking a little differently about what those intervention points are, what those triggers for intervening might be. That's not to say those tools aren't useful, and sometimes we do have to just save the crop. But there's a different thinking process now in the profit versus the yield, and is that actually going to pay for itself? So if I've got a weed threshold out there and it's 10 weeds per acre, for example, and that's what the local agronomist says, well, now we need to get out and spray. I counted 10 in an acre. Is that 10 really going to knock that yield back that much? And of course, it depends on the weed. Same with insects. Sugarcane aphids in our milo crop a few years back was definitely one of those where we really had to look at what stage those aphids were in, how far along the crop was, and what our beneficial insect populations were at the time. And many guys were able to avoid that costly insecticide application because the aphids were far enough along in their life cycle, the milo was far enough along in its growth cycle, and the beneficial insect populations were high enough where we really weren't going to see an impact from those sugarcane aphids. Yet they were there and they were part of the field, and many people went ahead and sprayed, and they probably lost money because they weren't assessing the entire system that was out there.
What a great answer. By the way, I don't think that applies just to no-till. That's an attitude that anybody in a farming situation should have, which is think about profit. A good friend of mine and a partner of mine in the past, Mark Shepard, talks about what he calls stun, and he even himself will define that differently in different contexts. But it's either strikingly terrific utter neglect or seriously terrible utter neglect. But the point is, he said, if I can get my farming more and more towards stun, that means I'm using less and less of my time, which is the most valuable asset that I have, which gives me higher and higher profits in almost all. So that's an attitude that's just vital, and yet it's not the one that most people have. So staying on the what extension agents will recommend and so on, is there a lot of pressure on, again, most farmers who have not yet adopted a no-till method to not do it? And where is it coming from today? I know it was probably in a different place 10 years ago. Where is that negative pressure coming from?
Yeah, there's really quite a bit of investment into the iron manufacturing. So there's a local, we'll pick on John Deere, but we could pick on Case. We could pick on any of the major equipment manufacturers, and they're still selling tillage equipment. And so their local customer base that shops at that local store, those folks are probably friends. They may go to church together. They may have kids in school together. And so there's a pressure there. I'm in business, so you need to help keep me in business. With the agronomy, that's kind of a mixed bag, but certainly your local agronomist and agronomist services are somewhat dependent on the amount of product that they can sell their customer base, whether that be seed, fertilizer, chemical, whatever it is. They are on the hook to try and sell that product. Now, counter to that is they can also sell cover crop seed, and they can sell other diverse crops that aren't our mainstream set of crops that are grown here, at least in the Plains region. And then the USDA policies, the Farm Bill has a lot of rules and regs that farmers really have to comply with if they're going to be a part of those payments. So, for instance, there are parts in the West where a cover crop has to be determined or terminated a certain number of days ahead of the planting of the cash crop in order to prevent it from robbing moisture. In the eastern part of the same state, they don't have to terminate ahead. Matter of fact, they can terminate that cover crop after the crop is planted. And so the policies that are put there in place by USDA, particularly as it applies for crop insurance, have a big impact on making these changes, because now you may be putting at risk some of those program payments from USDA if you violate their rules anyway.
And that all of that's very unfortunate, especially the front end, because I think for the most part, the farm community, the farm culture is a very people-centric one and very loyal one, and so that pressure to support friends that might be the deer dealer or the case dealer or others, and to buy equipment. And then associated with that is that sometimes the lenders make it appear to be very easy to buy equipment. And so farmers get highly over leveraged at times with equipment purchases. And once you get into that cycle, it's hard to get out of it, because usually you end up just kind of trading something in, and that way you eliminate the need to come up with some big chunk of cash at some time, and so on. And that's the other thing, for those of you that are listening that aren't in the farming industry, you need to understand that it's a very risky one, in the sense that all your costs are up front and all your income is at the end. There's just no middle ground typically. And so you take all the risk, all the costs, and then you wait till even after harvest, sometimes long period of time, because you need to store until prices go to the point where you believe they need to be before you can ultimately sell. So anyway, that's not something that is the case in very many businesses, and that's a long period of time. It's a 90-day period at the minimum, and 6 months or more on average. So cash flow.
You mentioned landlords, and that's another negative pressure, quite honestly. Landlords who may or may not have been attached to the land through a previous generation, or may have been, but no longer live close to that piece of property. Most of our farmers are dealing with multiple landlords, and each one of them has their own expectations of either a payment related to the production on that land. It can be a crop share or a cash rent, or they have a particular way that they want that land managed. And if that's how their grandfather's grandfather did it, it's probably going to be very intense in tillage and not very diverse in the number of crops that were raised. And so farmers must work through those relationships with those landlords. And I'll point to a spot on our website, a video series we did with Ryan Spear, and how he works with landlords to try and help them understand how soil health can improve not only their property, but also their bottom line. And he shares the risk with them. And so, landlords are another big influence within decision-making in the agricultural community.
Tell us again about your live conference. And again, because we've went through a year here where the pandemic wiped out most live conferences in the last year, and now we're moving ahead to where it looks like conferences are all going to be starting again. Tell us about the conference, a little bit maybe about costs, if they're lodging right there, if people come and so on. Just
Sure.
That's a little bit more of a plug-in for that, if we could.
Sure. So our 2022 conference will take place in Wichita, Kansas. It will be pre-conference workshops on January 24th. And so there will be 2 workshops that day. One is sort of just basics of soil health, all-day workshop. The other one is advanced concepts in soil health, again, an all-day workshop. The 2-day regular conference will be January 25th and 26th. Each day we'll have a general session where we'll open up the day with a couple of inspirational and educational speakers. One of them is going to talk about mental health aspects of farming and the things that changed his life and how he turned to soil health to help his mental part of daily life. And that's Ben Taylor Davies. The second general speaker, Erin Martin, she's a gerontologist, and she's going to talk to us about how soil health and food quality can help with the aging process. One of the things that really struck me about her is some studies that she looked at that said the pockets of 100-year-old people have one thing in common. They eat naturally grown foods and they exercise. And so food as medicine is kind of the theme there. Each one of those days will also have multiple breakout sessions where we'll have mostly producer speakers. Agricultural producers will make up most of our speakers, and each one of them will have hour-long breakout sessions. We'll also have several producer panels. One of the topics is going to be cover crops in an arid region and cover crops in a moisture-rich region. Livestock integration is going to be another one of our panels, and so that will occur on January 25th and 26th. The cost is $225 for those 2 days, and you can actually combine those with a pre-conference workshop and get a discount. We will have the conference at the Wichita Marriott. There is about a couple hundred rooms there, but there are lots of hotels locally right there within walking distance of that Marriott. So you can come, you can park, and you won't ever have to leave if you don't want to. We'll have lots of networking opportunities for you and our speakers, as well as other producers from around the country and the world to interact with one another in a social setting as well. So again, January 24th through 26th, 2022 in Wichita, Kansas.
By the way, everybody, that's a bargain price for a 2-day conference, and anything in the, I'll just broadly call it the alternative ag industry. So that's a bargain. And at the end, Steve talked about what I think a lot of people see as the most valuable thing for conferences, which is networking. And especially if you're new to this, you'll get so much out of just having the ability to talk to other people who are already doing it, and hopefully from wherever they're from is near where you're from, or similar situations that you would have in terms of your climate, probably, or your rainfall more than anything. Steve, what you said your best guess would be 25% of the land in the area that you have knowledge of that would the crops would be farmed today with no-till. What would be a goal for 5 years from now, and let's say 10 years from now, for that number to go to? And what's going to have to happen to be able to reach those goals?
Yeah, I'd say 5 years from now, if we could inch that number up 15%, that would be a really good achievement. 10 years from now, I'd like to see more than 50% of the acres in crop production and vegetable production be in a continuous soil health system. The things that are going to have to happen is it's going to be driven by consumers. There's going to have to be a desire and a market for foods grown in that system so that premiums can be desirable and available to those producers. Producers, farmers, growers are businessmen. And so they have to have a competitive advantage to make some of these changes. And so motivating them by offering the opportunity for them to make a little bit more money for the investment and particularly for the risk is going to be a big part of that. Addressing some of the USDA policies has to be a part of this. We've seen the current administration give signals that they will focus more on carbon farming or practices that improve carbon in the soil. That is a big part of what happens in a soil health system, is that there's addition of carbon through organic matter, and there's not a release of that same carbon through tillage. And so that appears to be on the horizon, but I would expect, at least based on the current makeup of our Congress, that it will be voluntary incentive based, and that will be the first stepping stone. And then hopefully, as the momentum builds and folks see that there is perhaps more money, less investment to be made in producing crops that way, it will just become a cultural norm. That seems to be the best method to get the agricultural community to change, is making it a cultural norm, not through a top-down carrot and stick approach. And so it does take time, and more producers will adopt it as those premiums are made available, and some of those negative forces are either removed or certainly loosened just a little bit.
Okay, great. Mark, do you see any questions from the audience that are throw in here? Yep, we got some time. That's why I was throwing it out now. And this is one where please don't feel bad if you just don't have any, or if you don't feel like you have any answer at all. But what if I'm a very, very small farmer? I literally just produce in a quarter-acre field behind my house for myself and my family and my neighbors. And you can do that, by the way. You can produce a lot of food on a quarter-acre in certain locations. What would be a tool that you'd use for no-till? Because obviously you're not going to use a disc that, no matter how sharp, because it's too big to be using in your back, in that very small size that you'd be working with. Is there any tools that you can help the people to know about? And again, if that's just not an area that you cover, just say that.
No, actually, I do that on my own, Wayne. My garden is quite large, and I try to practice what I preach. And there are some things that I do that anybody could do. One is keeping that living root growing. So if your 20 by 10 garden plot, or your bigger than that quarter-acre garden plot, is going into a winter period where you're not going to be growing anything, find a winter hardy grass, a wheat, a rye, barley, and plant that. Keep that soil fed during that cold period of the year, and then when it comes to spring, there's already something growing there, and so you can then utilize that in your spring planting as well. So you can roll that cover crop down, you let it get a stem on it, and almost start to form a seed head, or even form a seed head, and then you can break that stem, and that will terminate that plant. And you can do that without tillage, and you can do that without a chemical application. And so that's two fairly easy things that most people can do that will have an immediate impact on their soil and likely improve their garden. It will take a little practice. It takes a little management. I plant that kind of thing more in strips than I do across the entire garden. But keeping something growing is probably the most important thing that a home gardener and a home food producer can do. Even if you don't intend to eat it, keep something growing out there.
What a great description there. That's awesome. Let's see. What would you say is the best way that non-farmers out there, totally urban folks, maybe they're using, aquaponic systems on their porches, or they've got something in their windowsill, can do to help? Because I've heard you mention USDA a number of times, and I haven't said it in a real positive way, that their influence has been somewhat negative. What can non-farmers do to help here?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that they can do is to educate themselves about what is healthy soil. Even on their lawn, it's important that they have healthy soil. Understanding that growing something in a monoculture, so the manicured lawns that we see in our urban neighborhoods, that's not necessarily the best thing for your soil. It may be the best thing to sell your house with, but it's probably not the best for your soil. Understanding that not every plant that is not a grass isn't a bad plant. Did you know that you can eat dandelions? Did you know that clovers provide pollen and nectar for bees to make honey? Be a little bit more accepting of some of those other plants in your yard because they're only helping your soil, and they may be something that you could use as a resource yourself. And the other part of that is just understanding how food in the United States is produced and through the process politically, how those policies that are set are voted on. We have a farm bill, and that farm bill is typically authorized every 5 years, and that gives direction to USDA. So you as a voter have an opportunity with your congressmen and your senators to make an impact and say, I would like to see more soil health friendly policy enacted in the next farm bill. It's pretty easy. If they don't know what that means, educate yourself so that you can tell them, what does a soil health friendly policy mean? Meaning that it encourages people to grow a diverse group of plants, that they don't use tillage, and the things that I've talked about leading up to now. There's pretty simple things that consumers can do as well. Ask, how was this particular plant grown? Can the grocer answer it? If not, why not? We have a pretty good understanding of what organic means. At least we think we understand what organic means. Did you know that organic doesn't mean no-till? Organic often does use tillage because that is their weed control method. Could the organic be no-till and use cover crops for weed control? It sure could be. And so all organic is not created equal. Just because it says it's organic, does that mean it's more nutrient dense than a conventionally produced piece of fruit? Definitely not. And so understanding what all these terms mean, understanding how you as a consumer can influence what's on the shelves by speaking to your grocer, those are all things that the average citizen can do that can support the production of food in a different fashion.
That was a great answer. And by the way, I love just talking about organic. And by the way, everybody may not know that there is a group out there that is working very hard to try to get another sort of designation made for the food we eat, which would be regenerative organic, where hopefully it would take into account a number of these other soil health related factors and nutrient rich situation of the food itself. And there's even a move out there by the Bionutrient Food Association. One of our speakers we've had several times, and talking about how we maybe even could create some technology to where you can point it at an orange or a batch of kale or some lettuce or even some wheat in a container, and know what its nutrient value is right on your phone. I think that's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, just when that will happen. So, Mark, any other questions? We got about 5 minutes left. Steve, you've been amazing, and I'm going to end the very last thing. I'm going to have you just give last little bit, not the detail you did before, but about the conference in coming up in January, and then anything else that could a non-farmer become a member? I'm assuming your organization is funded by some extent by members' fees and such. Isn't that maybe another way we could help support what you're doing?
Yeah.
Probably categories.
Sure. So anyone that attends any of our events through the year, we consider them a member. We're pretty broad in the way we look at our membership. We want people to want what we offer. So we don't charge a separate membership fee. And anyone can sign up for our newsletters at any point on our website. We do take donations on our website as well. But we really want to encourage membership through participation. We have a number of events coming up this summer in this general region where we will be visiting a soil health farmer's farm. One is coming up on June 23rd in Blackwell, Oklahoma. We have another one July 15th out in Hugoton, Kansas. And if all things go well, another in August, on August 10th up at Lincoln, Nebraska at the Rogers Memorial Farm. Those are all low cost events, and anyone is welcome, although we do have some limits, people limits. But that's the way we encourage membership is participation. And we don't exclude that to just farmers. We have foodies, we have gardeners, we have the media, we have conservation professionals, we have political figures, all invited and come to our events throughout the year. And so it really is a broad base that we try to reach with the information that we can provide. And then as far as the conference goes, we welcome anyone to come to the conference. I think it's an eye-opener for someone who's never been to something like this, and the level of discussion that occurs, particularly outside our breakout sessions in the hallways and in the evenings at dinner time, the networking that occurs, and the ideas that get exchanged. And it's not just about how do I grow a better corn crop, or how do I remove tillage from my system. It's a much broader conversation that occurs outside of those breakout rooms. We use that more as a catalyst for the conversations than anything. So really anyone is welcome at our events.
Awesome. Well, we are right getting up at the top of the hour. Mark, do you see any questions out there from the audience? And if you guys, you really should ask some. No bad questions, by the way.
Yeah, so through the website, there's a contact form that you can reach us. You can also just email us at info@notill.org, or you can call the number at 785-210-4549. All of those are acceptable ways to reach us if you have questions or you're looking for some information.
Well, Steve, you're not is unbelievable. Your passion is catching, and I caught it when we talked. And I've been a No.Till fan for many years, but your enthusiasm even caused me to have more. This has been awesome. I told you this before, if you would think about some other of your farmers who might be great speakers for us at some point, we should. So,
Yep.
I think that's on my end. I think that's ringing somewhere else, but there's a phone ringing there. I don't know whether you guys heard it. But anyway, if you've got names and even maybe some of the founders, if they're still around, and we'd love to have those folks on, because that would even promote what you're doing more. So
Sure.
Mark, do you have any other questions? Or Eve, if you're out there, you have any other questions?
Nothing from my side right now. I think it was pretty much.
Well, both of these guys get No.Till going in their countries at some point, in Bangladesh and Pakistan in a bigger way. I'm sure there is some already, but even in a bigger way. So with that, oh, go ahead, Mark. Yeah, but I will tell you, I bet it isn't very natural, because you are doing what I'm sure, I know it's right when I came in that Steve was talking about. You are turning that soil over. You're taking that dead stuff underneath and pulling it to the top. That is the traditional way of tilling. And so it's not. So anyway, Steve, thanks again. Mark, thank you.
Yeah.
Audience, thank you. Arif, thank you. And we will probably give it a say a bye-bye. And do you want to end with anything, Steve? Give last words of wisdom.
I would say this: long live the soil.
Yeah, that's good. It's a good one. Well, thanks, everybody. Mark, why don't you take us out?